Welcome to Afros and Audio's Black History Month interview series. My name is Talib Jasir, founder and CEO of Afros and Audio Festival and the Vanguard Podcast Network. I'm excited to spotlight 29 outstanding indie podcast creators and professionals who answered the call to be a part of this series. My guest today is Whitney Knox. Welcome, and thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So, my first question is, start by telling us about your journey from being a civil rights attorney to becoming an anti-racism and DEI educator, and what inspired you to start the Impostrix podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm Whitney Knox Lee, and I am the host of Impostrix podcast. I just also, before I answer your question, want to just give you your accolades. I am a fan of Afros and Audio. I have not been, but everybody's always talking about it. And the reason I haven't been is because I'm new on the scene.
Right.
And as I kind of got acclimated and began researching Black podcasters and Black podcasts, Afros and Audios kept coming up. And that kind of launched me into the Black Podcasters Association and the BPA Awards and all these things. And I'm looking forward to attending Afros and Audios next year. So
Awesome.
thank you to you and your colleagues who make those types of opportunities available to us because it's so important. So important. So to answer your question, really the DEI work came first, I would say. And when I say that, what I mean is I have been very interested in race and what race means for me as a Black woman, for my family members, and for people in my community um, from an early age. And it was in college when I started really becoming more of an activist around race and understanding, I think, from an adult lens, like what was going on. And I went to law school with every intention of becoming a racial justice advocate. And when I got my first jobs practicing law, it was not in civil rights, actually. I was a attorney doing legal services work, working with poor people, low-income folks, and elderly folks providing services. And I had moved from the Northwest, from Seattle, down to Albany, Georgia, which is the deep, deep South. It's in an area that's known as the Black Belt in the southern United States because that's where a lot of Black communities are, Black poor communities, and that's also where a lot of like Black agriculture happened, and a lot of those communities remain there. So, although the work that I had set out to do didn't have the name of racial justice work, it was really important to me to make sure that I was approaching my work with an anti-racist and racial justice lens. And so what I mean by that is just for me, how that showed up was acknowledging that I'm Black, that I am working in rural South Georgia, that I was terrified of the myths and the realities of my safety or lack thereof. And when I had started in that position, it was 2014. And around that time was when we started using our phones to record everything. And so over the years that I was down there, we were learning about police brutality against Black drivers. And there came a point where something had happened. I don't remember what. It was before George Floyd. Someone had been murdered by the police. And it became impossible for me to separate my Black self from the work that I was doing and from the legal spaces that I was entering. And at that point in my professional journey, everything changed. I was no longer able to just do the legal work. It then became doing the legal work and advocating for other people of color within white dominant careers. It became trying to call out systems of white supremacy that exist culturally, but also within the legal profession. Um, and it really became a point where I started learning about how can I educate others, not only about my experience, but about the language that we can use to start describing our experiences, to start communicating what we're dealing with in the workplace and outside of the workplace. So that's really how I developed as a DEI consultant. I've had been lawyering up until recently and decided to start educating full time. And of course, I've got this podcast now. So that's kind of where I'm at. I got into civil rights a couple of years ago, worked as a civil rights attorney in prisons and jails here in Georgia and also in Alabama, and really just felt like that. It wasn't my calling to be working within the legal system, I'll say.
Got you. So Impostric is an extension of the work
Yeah.
or a
Yeah.
complement to the work.
And really, one of the things I love about podcasts is their accessibility. And my internal conflict that I have with the DEI profession itself is that we are tools of employers oftentimes. And the short of it is, we're tools of employers to help employers skirt liability. And that may be liability around racial harassment or discrimination or sexual harassment or whatever the issue may be. We are a group of consultants that come in, teach people how to behave better, so as to not break the law. And if you've got good consultants, then it's more about the people and less about the law and acting better so that you're not violating the law. But regardless, there's a conflict for me personally because my goal isn't to help employers not be liable for things. My goal is to help people interact better with each other, to help us navigate cross racial and cross cultural environments, to help make sure that everyone feels like they can be authentic in their workplace, like they are accepted, like they are celebrated, like they are thriving. And so the question became, well, how do I share this information, this educational information and my experience in a way that's not attached to the employer consultant contract? I approach my work with as much integrity as possible, but at the end of the day, I'm there to do a job and the employers who hired me. So it doesn't feel free from conflict. And so I started the podcast, Impostrix podcast, in order to provide some of the same information from an educational perspective, but also from a lived experience, personal, like we're just hanging around talking perspective, outside of the relationship with an employer.
Yes, yes. I can imagine that's quite limiting, stifling, repressive, oppressive, suppressive, all of the S's. And so I get it. I definitely get it. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your background for the Impostric podcast.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that you, and it's in the title, one of the issues that you address is imposter syndrome and racial
Yes.
toxicity.
Yes.
So how do
Yes.
you think these challenges uniquely affect professionals of color, and what impact do you hope your podcast has on them?
Yeah. So let me first break down imposter syndrome, or imposter phenomenon is really what the term is. And it was coined by two white female psychologists in Atlanta, actually, in the 1970s. And the studies that were done, at least for that paper that came out on imposter phenomenon, was done on middle-aged, middle-class white women, not middle-aged, middle-class white women who were high achievers. And what I mean by high achievers is they were people who were pursuing their PhDs or advanced degrees. They were people who were lawyers or doctors, top of their class at the Ivy League colleges. And these were the private clients of these two psychologists. Their names were Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they noticed this phenomenon of self doubt, of even though there was all this objective evidence to show that these people are amazing, These people are successful. These people have every right to be proud of themselves and to stand confidently. These people experienced this doubt that was limiting for them. And when they were successful, they attributed that success to luck instead of to their own accomplishment, their own hard work, their own brilliance. They attribute it to luck. But when they fail, they attributed that to their lack of genius, if you will. Like they felt as though that was their true capability, their true showing, and that whenever they succeed, they've just like kind of duped somebody, you know? And so now most people refer to this kind of phenomenon as imposter syndrome. And it's something that I've certainly experienced as an attorney, as a Black woman attorney, where I'm walking into spaces and very unsure about my qualification to be here. Even though I did all the things. I'm at this point, I've been practicing law for 10 years. So I'm kind of approaching mid career. Um, and still, there are times when it feels like I shouldn't be here. And I became really interested in that because I had an experience that where the language that I had for my experience was imposter syndrome, but I realized after the fact that it wasn't imposter syndrome at all, it was white supremacy. And that it was white supremacy that was making me feel like I didn't belong. And that experience was that, and I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening have had similar experiences. I went to a professional conference for attorneys, for public defenders, actually, and everyone there was white. Not only was everyone there white, the physical location of the space was in like a rural kind of lodge area that had decorations that did not make me feel safe. So it was deer heads, which I know Black people, people of all types hunt. I'm not saying anything about that. But it was deer heads on the wall and guns and just white people everywhere. And for those of you who have seen the movie Get Out, this was I felt like I was in the sunken space. People were very, very nice to me, but almost too nice. Almost like, oh, there's a Black girl here. Let's go see what she's doing. Let's say hi. Let's introduce ourselves. It was very eerie, very much feeling like I just didn't belong. I didn't feel like I could be my fullest self. I felt distracted while I was participating in the conference. I didn't feel like I was going to be physically harmed. What I felt, though, was that I wasn't going to be able to learn like other people in the room were going to be able to learn because I was so distracted by being by myself, by feeling like an outlier, by feeling like I didn't belong. And so it's not that I felt that I didn't belong because I didn't think I was smart or I didn't think I knew how to do some of the legal tasks. I was in the right place for the subject matter, for the content that I was going to be learning, but everything else was mismatched. Everything else didn't vibe with me at all. Um, and so what I thought I was experiencing then was imposter syndrome. Like I was very shy. I was not as outgoing as I usually am to network with others. And I just felt like I shouldn't be there, like I didn't belong. Instead, what I was experiencing was a culture where whiteness is the standard, is the norm. And so that's what I mean when I say white supremacy. I don't mean the KKK. I don't mean that there were people in hoods standing outside of the hotel that this conference was held at and they were throwing stones. What I mean when I say white supremacy is the elevation of whiteness and white culture over all else. And that's what I felt. I felt like there was no consideration for having even panelists of color in that conference, for having a conference in a space where Black people could feel less like some unique unicorn. And I mean, both in terms of the physical space, what the hotel looked like, but also the location itself, the city that it was in, a city where literally no Black people live, a mountain town. And so that experience that I had about 2 years ago, that had me starting to question, like, whether or not this imposter syndrome narrative that I know about is actually imposter syndrome, or, like, is that just white supremacy? And so that's where I'm at now is, yes, I can have self-doubt as a professional, um, particularly where I'm doing something new, where I'm learning or where I'm being stretched to grow. That's normal, that's healthy, that's humility, that's integrity, all the things. But also, there are a lot of times where I feel like I don't belong because I don't. And I think it's okay for us just to say that instead of trying to make it like an internal malady that we're experiencing because it's not us.
I love so much of everything you just said. For obvious reasons, I can relate in so many ways. And one of the main reasons for Afros and Audio Podcast Festival, a space of belonging, a space where you can feel confident to ask any question that comes to your brain and your heart, and to experience other people in a way that is relatable and comfortable.
Mhm.
Right. And there's so much space for that opportunity, especially since we find ourselves in the opposite spaces about 60 to 75, maybe to 85% of our professional careers. As a Black man, I can say that there is always one of me in the space. One. And when there's another one hired, we are both equally shocked. I had a coworker and he said when he saw me sitting at my desk, he was being interviewed. He was like, "Oh, well, they already got one. I'm not getting this job." Right. And so they hired him. And again, we were both equally shocked because for me, my experience is there's only one. And it's just me sitting there.
Mhm.
And I often joke when we go to the boardroom and that the whole table is filled with white folks. We just go in and sit down with our coffee and our notepad and we do it. But if there was a room full of us and a white person came in the door, I think he or she would come out. Am I in the right space? Because that
Mhm.
would be foreign. That
Mhm.
wouldn't make any sense. That would be like, where am I?
Mhm.
But for us, it's the most normal piece of our existence, but it's not normal at all. It's normalized. And so I appreciate everything that you've said. Obviously, we could commiserate because
Yeah.
this is about you. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I was just gonna say,
go ahead.
sorry,
No,
you
please.
had asked, what do I hope listeners gain from Impostrix podcast? And the purpose for the show was to normalize for ourselves, for people of color, and name the experience that we have so that as we're having the experience, we're not thinking that it's us. We're not thinking that it's about us. So many of us experience this on a day to day basis, on a minute to minute, hour to hour. I live in Atlanta, so lots of Black folks, and oftentimes I can be in spaces where there are other people of color. But I grew up in Seattle, and I was one of a handful of students at my high school. I would take the bus from my multicultural neighborhood to North Seattle because Seattle is a very segregated city. At least it was at the time, 20 years ago now, I guess. But me and my sister would take the public transportation from the Black part of town to the white part of town to go to our private Catholic school. And I experienced it back then, the feeling of, but as you said, at this point, this is a skill. It's a skill for us to be able to go sit at a table and like put on the face, do the code switching, do the whatever it is that we need to do. Um, and so the podcast talks about all of these experiences. The season finale that I did with Carrie Ann Suarez, who is the executive director and president at Equity in the Center, which is a race equity at work consulting and education kind of think tank, if you will. We talked about white supremacy and we talked about this idea of flipping the table of white supremacy and building our own tables. And we talked about the privilege that we have as Black professionals, as Black leaders, to be in mixed race spaces, to have gained power in whatever fields that we are in, and recognizing that privilege came with a sense of risk, one, but also some loss of identity in that we did need to code switch to get like ain't nobody able to just get to an executive director role or a management role being at work like they are at home. Like, no white people are comfortable being around that. They're not comfortable being supervised by people who speak differently than them. There's so many cultural dynamics at play, and it's a trip. Like, it's a trip to think about all of the decisions that we make throughout our day that ultimately come down to how authentic am I going to be today and how safe am I going to be? What risks am I going to be undertaking if I choose to go this direction instead of the other direction? So, the purpose of the show is to validate for people that it's not them, it's not me, it's a system of white supremacy that's got nothing to do with me. Other than that, I'm Black and I just happen to be on the wrong side of the white supremacy. And then to provide tools for us as we are navigating in these workspaces, not only to advocate for ourselves, but to be allies in solidarity for other people of color. Because what I've also learned, what I love about podcasting itself, is how much we learn from our guests. So, what I've also learned is that people of color, we are not all the same. Black people are not all the same. And I knew this, but I know it in a different way now in terms of how we experience the workplace. And I've got a lot of work that I can do to be an ally to other people of color, to Asian people, to indigenous folk, to folks living with disabilities. And so the show is really meant to provide tools to allow us to participate in that kind of advocacy in a way that's meaningful and impactful so that as we are growing into leaders, as we are growing to be executive directors or chairs of boards or Supreme Court justices, that we have our values intact and that when we are making decisions around the workplaces that we occupy and around the communities that we live in, we are making sure that those decisions have us in mind.
Absolutely. It's so important, mainly because if we don't, they won't. They are privileged enough to live in an existence where awareness is not necessary. And so there's a lot of lack of awareness, and that can make you feel like it is me. I am tripping. Am I being impossible right now? So, yeah, like I said, we could talk. This is about you, but I am resonating.
Mhm.
And in April of last year was my final goodbye to this corporate world because
Mm.
like, you know what? It's not about my performance. I've been in a career for 19 years. It's because I'm unwilling to perform anymore. I'm just unwilling to perform. Make you comfortable. It's over for me anyway. And the other thing is I recognize the privilege inside of being able to walk away. Wow, there are others who can't and have to deal every day with these micro and macro aggressions because we use micro a lot, but there's some serious stuff getting thrown
It's just
on a
straight up
regular basis.
aggression.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. So, moving on to the next question.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so much. This is so important. You mentioned that starting your podcast and submission led to significant changes in your life,
Yeah.
including leaving your job, like we just talked about for me. Can you elaborate on how podcasting has influenced your career path and your personal growth? And you've spoken about it a little bit, but maybe this is a different spin.
Yeah. So this is my favorite thing to talk about from 2023, now that we're in 2024. And that is what podcasting has done for me. Because let me be clear, I have not made any money from podcasting. Like I did not leave my job because I've got some sponsor somewhere that's paying me to be a podcast. Like I'm still doing all the things. I'm still editing my stuff. I'm still finding my guests, booking my guests, doing all the things. What podcasting has given me, though, is a roadmap for life in a way that I didn't expect. So, what I mean by that is podcasting has given me so many examples of people who are living within their values, of people who have taken risks in their lives, and some failed, got up and learned from those lessons. Others succeeded and are living their best lives. I spent most of last year talking about and feeling unhappy at work, feeling like I wanted to get off the treadmill, feeling like the work wasn't aligned in my values. Not the work itself, like, yes, obviously, I want to, or maybe not obviously, I do want to advocate for people who are incarcerated to get out of prison and jail and to be treated like humans. That's important work, but it's the system that I was working within, the legal system itself that I have conflict with. This, frankly, system of capitalism that I really struggle with because it's a system of racial capitalism, and trying to figure out for myself what that means and how I move forward because, yeah, like I do have to make money to live. So, at any rate, I had spent so much of the year living in that discomfort, but talking to people about what they did about it, that at some point it gave me the courage to start doing something about it for my own dang self. And I believe in God. I think there was a lot of divine intervention that happened in my life that led to me quitting my job. Because in all honesty, it was more of a forced quit. Like, I don't want to be here. They don't want me to be here. And I knew that I had cultivated enough skills over my professional life, both in the lawyering aspect, but also in the DEI anti racism education, that I could figure this out. I can make some money. And that's with 2 young kids and like a whole family, a mortgage, car notes, all the things that I thought. One of the myths that I'm having to unlearn is this myth that we carry in communities of color and people who grew up in poverty, that we have to have stable jobs in order to be successful, have enough money to maintain and support our families. And so it was the stability that was keeping me tied to the job. And becoming an entrepreneur and letting go of that false sense of stability that job gave me has opened my world, opened my mind, relieved my stress, taken some chips off of my shoulder, all of the things. And yeah, I still have fear about finances because, like I said, there's not money coming in from this podcast. But I feel like I'm so much more aligned with my values than I was before. And and what that has done in turn is made my mental and emotional health better. I did a whole episode just on my anxiety because I was coming out of an anxious moment where, I kid you not, Talib, I thought I was having tactile hallucinations because my anxiety was having a physical effect on my body. I am more present for my children and for my husband. And the work that I do now is work that I'm truly passionate about, that so it doesn't feel like work. I'm up until 1 a.m. in the morning working because for me it's fun and I've lost track of time. And that's the type of life that I want to live. And because I spent all this time with these side hustles, cultivating other skills, cultivating relationships with consultants, within a month of quitting my job, had people coming to me with contracts for me to do work, paid work. I have people coming to me wanting me to help to join them in starting nonprofit companies. Today, I filed my paperwork to start my own LLC. So the podcast and speaking to all of these people, no white people. Well, okay. I spoke to white people, but not on the podcast because the podcast, we elevate voices of color. So we do not have as guests white people. But in speaking to all of these people on the show and learning about their stories, learning about their tools, hearing the language, for me, it's a learning process too. So learning the language so that I can communicate better about what I'm experiencing or about what I'm teaching. All of that has really given me the courage to do what I've needed to do at the end of 2023. And I'm entering 2024 feeling much better, much more confident, and much more like rooted in my values than I did this time last year. And so, if anything, Impostrix podcast gave me what I needed to kind of change up some things to be able to live a life that felt more happy and more free for myself. That's one of the things that I intend on implementing in my trainings and education actually is the generational differences. I love Gen Z. Like, give me some Gen Z because um, I think older generations really view millennials and Gen Z as um, you guys aren't willing to put in the work or you're entitled. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. What it is though is that none of us should be dealing with this. None of us should have had to go fetch coffee in order to prove ourselves in the workplace. None of us should have to work for $10 an hour when we're doing three people's jobs and other people in the organization are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Like, we shouldn't have to be kind of putting in our dues just because the generation before us did that. Because none of us should have had to do it.
I am really enjoying this conversation. So, Whitney, completing the first season of any podcast is a significant milestone. Can you share some highlights from your first season and any challenges you faced along the way?
Yes. So, highlights, first and foremost, just getting it started. Like, I published 3 or 4 episodes for, like, my launch day or whatever you wanna call it, and I was just really proud of myself for doing that. Of course, the audio sounds like you would expect it to sound when it's a first podcast. Those episodes were with my sister circle, and I'm really glad that I did it that way because it was much less scary for me to have the people who support me, who have literally been by my side, who are my colleagues when I'm going through all of these experiences at work, and vice versa is the same. Um, and so that was great. Challenges continue to be the analysis paralysis of there's just so many options for everything all the time ever. Um, and so just making a decision and sticking with it, but also being willing to be flexible. So I was using a different type of recording software, didn't work out for me. Being willing to change to something else instead of continuing to like grind up against something that's just not working, particularly when my time was so limited. Because when I started, I was still working, more than full time at my day job, and then up until 1 or 2 in the morning doing podcasting every night. Um, so those are my challenges. Also, the tech is a challenge for me because I'm not tech savvy in this way. I've never done audio editing. I've never done video editing. I hate social media. So some of these other aspects of podcasting that I just didn't know were a part of podcasting. Like, I legit just thought I get a mic, I talk to it, and then I release the episode. Um, and I can do that, but nobody's going to listen because it's going to sound awful. And my thoughts are going to be all over the place. Those have been like, I'm really proud to have started and now completed an episode. Today I got my notification from BuzzFeed that I have uploaded 25 episodes, which is amazing. I also today got a notification from Good Pods that I'm ranked number 3 in the indie career podcasts on Good Pods, and also have ranking as top 10% in listen notes. So I'm really proud and excited about that and the growth that we'll continue to have.
I'm
Thank
so
you.
proud of you as well. And that is part of another reason for Afros and Audio is the sustainability of podcasts because, yeah, a lot of times I liken it to because I had locks for over 10 years. Like, podcasting is like natural hair. People think it's easy, but it's not easy to maintain at all. In order for me to look presentable in the way that I want to look, I have to maintain it and do work on it. And it's can sometimes take a whole weekend. So I get it, and I appreciate your willingness to be with the discomfort because the most important thing, and this is important for anyone with a message, is to understand that what you have to say is needed and necessary. So when we aren't willing to be with it and step out there, then there are people that are missing out on what they need from us. So congratulations again on the success.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in one of your responses, you talked about self-advocacy and conflict resolution in the face of racial toxicity. That's another big topic of your podcast. And so I wanted to touch on that a bit. Could you provide some practical tips for our audience on how to address these issues? I know you've got probably a large scale answer to that, but in the condensed version, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, first things first, we need to decide what kind of energy we're willing to give to these conflicts. So, particularly now, and as we gear up for the presidential election, there's going to be conflict. We are going to feel a lot of discomfort in the spaces that we occupy. We're going to feel a lot of discomfort online in the online communities that we occupy because of what people are saying or doing. So the first thing that I like to do when basically deciding like how invested I'm going to be in this conflict is deciding how much energy, like what does this relationship mean to me? So if it's a work relationship and I need to continue working with that person, that's very different than if it's a passing encounter with some random person, or if it's, for me, it might be a judge. So I've had situations where I felt like a judge was belittling me or talking down to me or disrespecting me because either I was young, I was a woman, or I was black, or all three. And so deciding how to address and what energy I want to invest in that is really important before I get started, because it could be, it's really easy in my experience to go all in on trying to resolve or manage conflict for a relationship that really just doesn't matter to me. And maybe I'm doing it because of my own ego and I want to show it to somebody, or maybe I'm doing it because I was embarrassed, or maybe I want to tell you a piece of my mind today. But I am left, when I'm dealing with race based conflict or culture based conflict, I'm left depleted. And it doesn't matter for me how good it might feel in the moment, I'm left depleted. Um, the next day, I may have an emotional hangover from it. And so, really taking a second to just understand for myself whether this is a conflict that needs to be addressed or not. And so we have options as far as how we want to address conflict. We can address it right on by interrupting somebody while it's happening and sharing our truth, or asking questions like, why do you say that? Or what makes you think that? Or can you rephrase that to me, because I'm not quite sure if I'm understanding what you're saying, and maybe it would help if you rephrased it. And doing stuff like that, particularly if it's like speech that's problematic, can help that person like take a step back and be like, "Oh, okay, like maybe something that I'm saying right now isn't quite right, or maybe I'm being offensive, or maybe I'm saying exactly what I meant to say." It just kind of helps to pause the situation. We can also just choose to do nothing and walk away and keep it moving. And the benefits to that are that maybe we're not spending all of our energy on this situation, and because it's not worth our time. But the drawback to that is we've been harmed, presumably, and so that means we may need to go find resolution for ourselves someplace else. We may need to go find healing or closure someplace else. And we can also take an opportunity to let someone in, to be vulnerable, and to educate. So I'm the first person that will say it's not up to Black people to educate other people. It's not up to Asian people to educate other people about how your racism makes me feel. But if we are invested in this, because maybe this is a colleague that we work closely with, so a team member, or maybe it is a client that we are working with and we don't have a choice about whether or not we're going to work with them, then we may want to have a more straightforward conversation about what's happened, what's transpired, and what it means to us, and what our request is. And I would frame it like that. This is what I just experienced. I don't know if you've meant it this way, but this is what my experience was on the receiving end of it. This is what it means to me. This is how it makes me feel. This is how it's going to affect my work. And then instead of doing what you just did, maybe you could try X, Y, or Z. Or maybe we can move forward with our working relationship in this way. And so that's kind of the decision tree that we have, especially when we're dealing with someone who is making statements towards us or doing an action that's making us uncomfortable. We can ignore it and keep it moving. We can address it kind of lightheartedly, make light of it, make a joke, ask a question about it to kind of stop somebody in their track, but not directly address it. and then we can directly address it and ask for a different change. And I'll say too, when it's ongoing conflict, that I really recommend finding a outside neutral person who can help the parties navigate what they're experiencing, because we all have our own position on what should be happening or what's happened in the conflict or why there's the conflict or what the conflict is even about. And sometimes when we're not able to communicate effectively, we'll talk past each other, or we'll talk at each other without a true understanding for where each other are coming from. And it can be really helpful to have a neutral person who is helping people to communicate what they're experiencing and their position in a way that people can understand. So basically, be a translator for the parties. And that's where stuff like transformative mediation comes into play, particularly in the workplace. That's something that I'll be doing more of in 2024 is mediation, conflict resolution, and conflict management. And I just also, I know I'm talking a lot, but the last point of that, the difference between conflict resolution and conflict management, I think it's important for us to know is that sometimes conflict isn't going to be resolved. And so the next best thing is figuring out how to manage the conflict, particularly in the workplace or in families, so that we can continue to move forward and do whatever it is that we need to do. In both cases, having a neutral person, a mediator, or a consultant who's actually working through that with you can be really helpful.
I think it's important. Obviously, all things that you said, I resonate. I appreciate it because HR is a weaponized space in a lot of ways in corporate America. And when you go and you talk about your grievances, and then they immediately offer that you all sit down together and talk, it's like that's not it. And you just actually made me feel unsafe and uncomfortable, and why I should go back to your office again. And that's deliberate. And so there are all these ways for us to navigate. It's about your podcast and what you're saying right now and the work that you've done is that language piece and also understanding what it is that we're feeling. I'm really looking forward to digging further into the podcast because I still ruminate over the unjustness of what I've experienced. It's hard. It's a challenge. How do you engage with your audience? What role do these interactions play in shaping your podcast content even, or has it?
Yeah, so it has, as far as the podcast content itself, I do I have ideas about topics that I want to touch on, or themes, really, not even topics, themes that I want to touch on. And when I'm speaking with potential guests, I give them my content pillars. I give them the things that um, the conversation needs to touch on one of these things in order to make it a conversation on Impostrix podcast, as opposed to just any random conversation. Um, but then I really let them take the lead on what they're comfortable talking about, what they're excited talking about, the things that they wish that they could talk about, but nobody ever asked them questions to talk about it. And then as far as listeners, I'm still working on my engagement strategy. I am on Instagram mostly and also LinkedIn. But I don't know, finding that essentially my community on Instagram is not my community that's listening to the podcast and vice versa. Like there is some overlap, but so it's been difficult for me to try and figure out, to try and be responsive, I think, to what listeners want. So I usually look at the reviews that people are writing for me. Spotify has, the question and answers that, frankly, for me, aren't really getting filled out. Um, but so I'm talking to people who are listening to the podcast. And a lot of these right now are people that are in my community who, like, I didn't even know listen to the podcast like that. But when I see them, they'll say, "Oh, Whitney, you talked about this, like the anxiety episode, and that made me realize that I'm experiencing anxiety and maybe I need to be on medication or maybe I need to go to a therapist. And like life doesn't have to be this hard." Um, and so when I get that type of feedback, I know that I'm doing something right, because let me tell you, the anxiety episode is my least favorite episode of season 1. Like I hate it. I hate that episode. But it helped one person, so I'm not deleting it. Like it's just going to stay up there and I'm just going to hate it. And it's going to be fine. But for
Yeah.
2024, I've got plans to do Instagram lives weekly. And then I'll also be doing a special series with, in collaboration with another podcast on legal issues that Black mothers may experience, and providing some legal information about that, because some of my background is in family law. And then I'm also going to be doing processing groups, which are going to be spaces where people can come and process what they're experiencing at work, the toxicity, if it's racial toxicity or working through the imposter experiences that they're having. So those are the two things, like right off the bat, that I'm going to be doing to help engage the audience and learn more about what people are dealing with and what they want to hear more about.
Those are all great strategies. And not only are they great for the growth of your podcast, but the engagement, interaction, and the education of your community. Because again, as you said, a lot of the DEI, you recognize that there is only half of the story being told or shared.
Yeah.
So there's still the saying that we're left with, where the reality is still the reality. So thank you for that. Any podcasts that have significantly influenced your approach to discussing anti-racism and DEI?
Yes, most of them are not in the podcast space necessarily. There's some folks on LinkedIn, Dr. Carrie Yazid. There are people who wrote, the gentleman that wrote My Grandmother's Hands. That book for me was really helpful because it talked about generational trauma and healing from racial trauma. Um, and then I have colleagues that I work with in this space who have taught me a lot about how to show up in this work, acknowledging the conflict that exists when we're working for employers. And there's a lot of people in my community that I really lean on.
Thank you for sharing those resources. Let us know social media links and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so my website is impostrixpodcast.com, and I am mostly on Instagram and LinkedIn. So my Instagram is at Impostrix Podcast, and my LinkedIn is using my name, Whitney Knox Lee. Where else? I plan to be on TikTok and YouTube more in 2024 because I guess one of my other engagement strategies is going to be doing more video content, both in terms of like short clips. I want to do some like current event episode type situations. So that's how you can reach me. All of my contact information, though, is on my website, as well as a free toolkit that I just created for listeners, which is a bingo sheet that challenges us to work within our values. So it's like the game bingo with a bunch of different values or goals that we might have for our work in 2024 or for any time period, really. And when you can check off 5 of those items, you can let me know. I will enter you for a drawing for free Impostrix podcast swag. And that'll be going for at least through March. So, yeah, that tool is available on the website, or you can also find me on Instagram and I can send it.
So thank you again. I really appreciate it. The conversation was amazing. I'm looking forward to staying connected. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I would love to have you on. We would have a great conversation on the show for having me.
Absolutely.